So, blank is a conflict management strategy that involves putting up with an undesirable outcome and giving up somebody else to benefit the relationship and your longer-term goals. How many folks here think that it is A, compromising? A couple people. Collaborating, endurance, and competition. Okay, so there's a little bit of a split here. So the best answer to this question is endurance. That's the third answer here. So endurance and compromise do have some similarities, but compromise is more focused on meeting in the middle, right? It's where you and the other person get some of what they want, but not everything. So the example we used last Friday was it's like splitting a pizza in half, right? Both people want the whole pizza, they only get half. That's okay, but it's not amazing. Endurance is more about putting up with the outcome that somebody else wants. So the Western equivalent, the closest Western approach to that is accommodating, right, where you're giving in to the other person. Endurance is a little bit different because under endurance, you're focused more on putting up with the conflict or putting up with what they want because you feel like it'll help the relationship and so on, right? I used the example last week of how a lot of people might choose to take on an unpaid internship because it's not what they want. Ideally, they'd like to get paid, and in many situations need to get paid, but would do an unpaid internship and endure that because it better helps them reach their long-term goal of getting the job that they want, right? So maybe you're interested in a career in Washington, D.C., get an unpaid internship, working for a member of the House of Representatives, and that is something that you endure to reach that longer-term goal. So endurance is the best answer here, and a way to distinguish some of these approaches. By the way, this is unrelated to anything else, but it came up in a previous class. If at any point you need to do anything like use the restroom or get a drink of water or anything like that, you do not need to ask. You're welcome to do that. I heard that there were a couple instructors who would require people to ask to do that. You do not need to do that. So just to let you know. At any rate, last class we talked about these different conflict styles, right? Endurance was a big one. And we did an activity where I was asking groups of people to discuss these kind of merged approaches. So merged approaches can include this idea of constructive controversy, where you're engaging in a conflict, but you're doing so in a respectful way that builds relationships and so on. I also discussed last Friday some of the resources that are available for you to support you. Again, I know most of you are returning students here at EOU. It might be redundant, but if you weren't here last Friday, or you'd like to know, some additional resources for things like tutoring, student success, and so on, those are available. And we talked about the role that culture plays in terms of shaping arguments. Our focus for today is not only talking a little bit more about the study circle assignment and some of the expectations for that assignment, but also getting into chapter 3 and a focus on deconstructing conflict. So there's a lot of ways that we can deconstruct and make sense of different conflicts that happen. This is a conversation that will start today. Today will be a little bit more lecture focused. And then on Wednesday, we're going to look at a case study, and I'm going to ask you to use some different conflict deconstruction strategies in order to make sense of that conflict. So again, the groups for the study circle are posted on campus. And in addition to that, I want to direct you to a couple of the resources that will help you for this assignment. And I'm also going to give you the opportunity for any questions that you might have related to this assignment. So if you go on the front page, you'll notice a couple things that are available here. One is the study circle rubric. The other is the study circle assignment guide. So because the study circle has a few different parts, I'm going to ask you to turn in a few different things. So this is a good place to start. So essentially, there are 3 major parts of the study circle assignment that I'm asking you to do, right? These are participating in the study circle on the day that you're assigned. Secondarily, it's completing a reflection on your study circle. And then third, it's completing a couple write-ups of at least 2 other study circles in the class. So, to kind of break this down, the way that your study circle works is during class, on the day that your group is scheduled, you'll, by this point, have a topic assigned, and your group members are going to discuss and talk about that topic, right? And it will likely be a topic where not everybody agrees or is on the same page. So for instance, one idea for a study circle is a topic about dress code policy. Should schools require dress codes? Why or why not? You might find that different members of the group disagree. Some people say dress codes are good. They, kind of unify the class. Other people say, I don't like a dress code. I think that students should be able to express themselves through clothing and so on. So people might disagree within the group. But the goal for this is to use these kind of constructive styles of conflict management. Have a conversation about this topic that you choose without it being this like heated argument or disagreement, right? That's the big thing that we've been trying to work forward in this class. As part of this assignment, one member of your study circle is going to serve as the facilitator, right? The facilitator role is a little bit different because, as we talked about last week, a facilitator is not necessarily somebody who is going to express their opinion really loudly, but instead is designed to help navigate or steer the ship. So, hey, I haven't heard from you. What are your thoughts here? Well, that's a good point. I'd like to hear an additional perspective. So the facilitator will help to mediate and oversee that study circle. So the study circle, again, is about group members discussing topic or issue. You might even find that members of your group largely agree on things, and that's okay. But it's a chance to have that kind of conversation. You'll have about a half hour for the group members to participate in that study circle and talk about the issue. Again, it can be pretty loose and conversational. It's not something where you have to go in having like things memorized and prepared. You might go in with a good understanding of the topic and some ideas on the topic, but you don't need to come in with a fully developed sense. And in terms of how the topic selection process will work, later this week, I'll give you a couple opportunities to chat with members of your group. You could even initiate that conversation sooner if you wanted to. And then from that, I'll be able to assign the group members different topics. So, your group will talk about this topic, and they'll do that in class. So part of your grade is, are you here on the day of your study circle? Are you participating in the conversation, right? Are you actively involved? The second thing that I'll ask you to do, and this is the bulk of your grade on this assignment, is that after the study circle, I'm going to have you, within 2 weeks of the day that you did the study circle, complete a reflection. And the reflection is about 3 pages, double-spaced, stand front and margins, blah, blah, blah. And in other words, I basically want you to reflect on that experience. What was it like participating in the study circle? What did you learn? What did you notice about conflict management? So maybe your members of the study circle took on a very collaborative approach. For instance, members of your study circle really agreed and really wanted to work together on a solution to the problem. Or maybe it was a much more competition-focused style where people pretty strongly disagreed with each other, right? So you might think about, how did the study circle go? What was your impression of that experience? How have some of the ideas and concepts we've talked about in the class apply to your study circle? And how might this impact how you think about and engage in issues of conflict management in the future? Again, a study circle is something that's used a lot in conflict management. It allows people to get together and to talk about an issue, and I think is a nice way for us to apply a lot of these ideas from the class. And then the last thing that I ask you to do is, before the end of the quarter, I'm going to ask you to complete 2 write-ups of 2 different study circles. So there's going to be a total of 4 in the class. You'll have 1. I'll ask you to report on 2 others. If you were not there or not able to make the class face-to-face on that day, that's okay. You'll still be able to watch the video for that day. And in your report, right, I'll ask you to share, what stood out to you about the study circle, what worked well, what didn't, and how does this study circle relate some of the ideas in the class. So maybe you said, you know what, when I was observing this study circle, I used this conflict management style and able to deconstruct the purpose, the goals, the participants, and so on. So each of those write-ups should be about page 4. So altogether, you're submitting the reflection and the write-ups, and then you're participating in the study circle. Again, the study circle is not a formal presentation. You don't have to come in with like notes and prepared material. You should just come in with a willingness to participate and engage in the conversation with an eye toward how we talk about conflict management issues in this class. The rubric for this assignment, again, I try to be clear on assignment expectations in the rubric. As you can see, this is a total of 250 points, 75 from the study circle, 125 from the reflection, and 50 from the write-up. Did you attend? Did you participate? Did you engage in conflict management? Again, were you respectfully participating and active in that discussion? In the reflection, did you use terms and ideas from the class to talk about and deconstruct that experience of participating in the study circle? And then in the write-up, right, have you talked about and engaged with the content of 2 other study circles? So again, that adds up to 250. So that's kind of what I'm looking for there. Again, I'll give you the chance to work with your group members later this week and to start to develop a topic. So I'll have you all brainstorm ideas, and I'll help you to finalize a topic for your study circle. And we'll kind of go from there. So for this assignment, does anybody have any questions, or is there anything that I can clarify for this? As we're getting closer, if you want to send me a draft of your reflection or your write-up, you're welcome to do that, right? Even if you're in a group, you're still going to be graded individually, so you'll need to turn in your own reflection after this assignment and your own write-up of other students. Right? This is not going to be a super intense experience, right? It's not like we're doing a public debate, but instead, again, it's a chance for conversation. And some people get worried about like being in a conflict and disagreeing. They find once they go in, okay, this is fine. So questions come up for me later, just let me know. I'm happy to answer those. So let's talk about the new stuff for today, which is about deconstructing conflict, right? And that's essentially what you are going to be doing for the reflection portion of your conflict management study circle activity. If you think about what it means to deconstruct something, right? Pretty obviously, it's the opposite of construct. It's taking something apart. One way that you might deconstruct, right, is if you're like deconstructing or disassembling a computer, right? You're taking the computer and then you're saying, okay, here's the microchip, here's the projector, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's the wiring, right? In the same way, deconstructing a conflict involves breaking down the conflict into the key parts and key elements that make that conflict happen. Deconstructing a conflict is different from de-escalating a conflict. This is not about making the conflict end. It's about saying, this conflict happened, why did it happen, what was going on? So if you and your significant other are arguing about the bills, and who should be paying the bills, how much money is going into the bills, right? Deconstructing conflict means understanding how different people disagree, what they're disagreeing over, and so on. And this is useful to us, including in the real world, right? Because past is prologue. If we deconstruct and understand what caused this issue to happen, then we can have tools to better deal with these types of conflict scenarios in the future. Think back to Bay of Pigs, right? What went wrong was that there was groupthink and dissenting views weren't able to participate or be taken seriously. As a result of deconstructing that, right, as a case study of what went wrong, a lot of like foreign policy leaders and experts now more readily welcome dissenting opinions. Although we've seen, right, that still has problems. So in order to analyze and break down a conflict, there's three kind of major artifacts or sources of evidence that we can use as a way of making sense of it, right? Those are tangible evidence, self-reports, and witness reports. And each kind of has some major strengths and weaknesses. So you and a spouse are arguing over bills. Who's going to pay the bills? Why was this amount charged to this account? Blah, 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 right? Tangible evidence would be the bill. So in this case, there's a disagreement over how to pay for different expenses. The tangible evidence is being used here because it is a documented physical source of the issue. If you've ever seen, like there's a major court case, you know, a lot of times they don't allow the general public to attend, and so they'll do these kind of drawings of the court, like oftentimes this like watercolor, like recreation of it. That could be tangible evidence too. It's a depiction of what happened. So books, legal documents, and so on are used as tangible evidence, and they're relevant if they play a role in the conflict as a whole, right? So oftentimes we'll do what's considered to be a desk review over different documents. So desk review is when you're surveying and making sense of these different documents to get a picture of what's going on. So maybe you and a spouse are disagreeing over how to pay the bills, and you decide to pull up a record of all the bills that you've been paying over the years to get a sense of what's going on. So you might do a broader survey of how bills are being paid to make sense of that conflict. The tangible evidence is really clear, really explicit, and is oftentimes our best way of understanding what conflict happened. Again, like documentation of the Pigs invasion and how it occurred, be used as tangible evidence. Self-reports, right? So we use self-reports all the time. A really good example of a self-report is if you have ever been in a car accident, you're engaging in a self-report because you're reporting to your insurance company or potentially to the police what happened. So you're trying to give an accurate depiction. You know, I was just going through, 12th Street, and all of a sudden I got T-boned by this car. They didn't stop at the stoplight, and it wrecked the front of my car. So you're describing what occurred from your perspective, right? You are reporting on what happened. A lot of times after a conflict or a disagreement, we'll kind of explain what went down. So a self-report can have bias, obviously. We're much more likely to be sympathetic to ourselves if we're reporting something like a car accident and saying, what were they doing? When it turns out that you were on your phone when the accident happened, right? Another issue in terms of self-reports is that they do suffer from a lot of the same gaps in our memory and ability to make sense of the event, right? So especially in a conflict where we become heated and we disagree with somebody, then our perception of what happened might look very different from the other person, which might look very different from like a third person or neutral observer, right? I never said that. This never happened. I'm not yelling. I didn't raise my voice. These are oftentimes sources of disagreement that come out from self-reports. So self-reports are impacted by three kind of major factors. One of them is our perception skills, right? Our perception is our ability to make sense of the events that we see every day in our lives. So for instance, if you've ever been told, or you've ever told somebody that they have selective perception, right, or selective hearing, it generally means that they have chosen not to listen to everything. So, if you're watching a political debate and a candidate you dislike gets up to speak, maybe you're not paying attention to what they have to say, you tune out, and so on, right? That could be how you're using perception differently. Perception involves how you're selecting, organizing, and interpreting information. So in this case, right, you're watching a debate, and you're choosing to tune out, you're selecting which of the candidates you're going to listen and pay attention to. You're organizing that information. What are the points that they had to say? So maybe you think they have some really good arguments about the US economy. And then you interpret and make sense of that and say, oh yeah, there's a better candidate. They're doing a better job in this debate. So perception, again, is how we make sense of the information that we receive. And when we are participating in a conflict and also trying to perceive that conflict, we're oftentimes going to get a gap there. There are going to be parts that we missed. Maybe we didn't realize that we did raise our voices, right? Another thing that plays a big role are our memory skills. So there's a lot of issues that might come about related to memory. One of them is the primacy effect. We tend to remember things at the beginning and the end the best. So if we're trying to recollect a conflict that we were involved in, we might best remember how it started. You know, I was having a conversation with somebody, and then I made this off-color joke, and we just started arguing, and then it ended with them slamming the door. We're also more likely to remember especially emotional moments, so moments that really struck us in a personal way. Although, right, we might also engage in something like repression, where we choose to forget or bury down certain events such that we don't remember them very well, right? Then the third issue that can impact our self-reports is our message encoding skills. In other words, how can we take the messages that we have and properly store them and make sense of them for later? So for instance, a memory encoding issue might be that you and somebody else are arguing, and they bring up, maybe it's arguing over how to disassemble a computer, and they argue, well, you don't know C++, and you don't know what that is, and you're not familiar with that term. That can affect your message encoding because if you're not familiar with the term or concept or idea, it's not going to be encoded or uploaded into your mind in the same way. So sometimes when we enter a conflict, our ability to report on and remember what happens is impacted by our ability to have been able to encode and make sense of that message in the first place. So again, self-reports can sometimes be useful to understand a conflict and to tell a side of the story, but if we're involved in the conflict, especially if it's emotional or heated, we're going to have issues such as bias that impact our recollection of events. We also have the idea of a witness report, right? So a witness is somebody external outside of the conflict who is able to report on the conflict and share what went down. So maybe you and a friend are arguing over where you should go to dinner. And you have a third person, another friend, who's just watching this all happen. And the third person says, you know what, you two were really going at it about whether you should get pizza or Chinese food tonight. It was hilarious. You two were very passionate about this. This would be a witness report. Third party who's sharing and talking about this issue. This is why a lot of times a witness report can be helpful in the context of like a divorce attorney, a couples counselor, or some type of mediator in a conflict, right? It's the third person who can report on what happened and try to issue, at least on paper, a more neutral perspective. One interesting thing that we'll get into next week is the way that culture plays into this too. So in what we would consider a more individualistic culture, right, one that's focused on our own personal achievement and goals, oftentimes it's seen as a good thing to have a witness or an outsider who does not have much familiarity with the issue. The idea being we get this neutral third party who gets to judge and think about the topic and render an independent decision. But in a lot of collectivist cultures, we tend to have people be a little bit more cautious and concerned about outsiders and are more interested in having a witness or a third party who is an insider and knows a bit more about the people and the conflict involved. It's kind of an interesting difference in terms of how we think about the reports of witnesses. But one thing to know about too, right, is that no witness is infallible. So, right? If you have ever seen any sort of court case where the witness gets questioned or cross-examined, right? We know that a lot of, in those cases, you have a witness who suddenly starts to doubt or question or rethink the things that they were talking about. So in 12 Angry Men, the kind of classic film and stage play that we looked at in the first week of class, one of the major issues brought into question in that film is a witness who was said to have observed a murder. But what gets brought up over the course of the jurors arguing is that this witness had marks on her nose that indicated that she was supposed to be wearing glasses. But it turns out that she wasn't wearing glasses and therefore was not able to see the murder clearly. So witnesses oftentimes can have a lot of gaps and problems in their testimony. If you've ever played a video game in the Phoenix Wright series, you also know that witnesses are not very good at their testimony either. Another issue here is false memory, right? So false memory is a really interesting and surprisingly common phenomenon where, oftentimes through the power of suggestion, we think that something happened or that we witnessed something in our lives, but that thing never happened. And one of the most classic cases is when somebody gets asked, oh, when you were younger, maybe like 4 or 5 years old, did you ever get lost in a mall and find yourself unable to get to see your parents, right? And maybe for some of you, you actually did get lost in the mall, but some of us might think, oh yeah, did I? Did I get lost in the mall? So we're not perfect when it comes to our memory, right? You might think about another example like the Mandela effect, where there are certain words, or like the, right, like the naming of certain things, like the Berenstain Bears, is there an A or is there an E? There are little things like that that are these common ways that we're misinterpreting or not remembering things correctly. So false memories can be a big concern too. Are we able to properly remember what happened if we're trying to report on a conflict? And all of this is really relevant to us because in order for us to make sense of a conflict and to deconstruct the conflict, we need the component parts. We need to understand what the heck happened. But that can be really challenging if the information that we have to go off of is pretty flawed, right? If the 3 major ways that we can analyze and deconstruct a conflict are hard pieces of evidence, the reports that members of the conflict exhibited, and the reports that outside witnesses observed, right? That history and that context can definitely pose a challenge. And there are ways to help deal with that, right? Recording is one way of doing tangible evidence that can be used for later. But as we can see, one major issue that can affect our ability to do conflict management is we engage in a conflict and our ability to recollect and understand what happened. Some of you reported, right? Like feeling like we weren't able to get along or understand the issue. That can be a really big issue here. So what this chapter does is it proposes 3 kind of larger models for how we can analyze and break down conflict. And I'm going to have us kind of split up to talk about and understand each of these 3 styles a little bit better. The 3 styles that are brought up in this chapter are Ware's Conflict Map, the Hocker-Wilmot Conflict Assessment Guide, and Change-Oriented Conflict Analysis. These are 3 different approaches that we can use in order to assess and make sense of the conflicts that we have every day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the rows here on the far end look at Ware's conflict map. I'm going to have the middle rows, and let's also have, if you are on the end over here on this side, you're going to join the middle group. Focus on the Hocker-Wilmot. And then everybody else, so everybody here on the end, will focus on change-oriented conflict analysis. What I'd like you to do is, within members of your group, look at the approach that you're assigned. What are the parts of the model? What does this model focus on within conflicts? And in what situations is this the most useful? So have somebody, as you're talking about this, write down some of your ideas and be prepared to share in about 7 to 10 minutes or so.
Oh, that's what, why the conflict not.
Sounds like most groups have moved on to the final question, so I'll give you just another couple minutes on this. It sounds like folks are wanting a little bit more time on this, so I'll give you some more time for today, and then we'll talk about this and present this again on Wednesday. So I'll give you a couple more minutes to work on this together. I'll grab your sheets of paper after that, and then I'll ask groups to share on Wednesday. All right, so if your group is wrapped up on discussion for the day, I'll grab the group's sheet of paper for attendance. What I'll do on Wednesday is go back your group's sheet and then ask you to share some of the things that you came up with. Since there's no new reading assignment, you might also use time between today and Wednesday to look again at these models and see if there's anything your group would like to add. We're going to be using the same groups on Wednesday anyhow, and having these groups look at how we can map a conflict under one of these three different approaches. So, to bring together some of the major things that we were talking about for today, we were talking about how deconstructing a conflict, right? It's like disassembling and breaking down a potential conflict into different parts. Deconstructing a conflict has these different models we'll be talking more about for Wednesday. I asked each group to look at one of those three major models, again, to help us examine different approaches. And then deconstructing conflicts, right, is oftentimes flawed. We're relying on things like witness testimony or self-reports that tend to have a lot of gaps and other issues. So what I'll have us do for next class on Wednesday is I'll hand you back your group's work. You'll share the model of conflict that you focused on, and then I'll have, after that, your group work on an example and a case study of how you can use that model to deconstruct a conflict in the real world. So what I'll do is I'll give each group the same conflict, and then I'll ask each group to use their assigned model to make sense of and deconstruct that one. So it'll be kind of an interesting way for us to apply and use the things that we've talked about so far. So that's the major things that I wanted to go over for today. Again, make sure that you pass forward your group's work, including your names. I'll enter that in for attendance. Otherwise,